Hello, my name is Simon Parrish, and I'm an ecologist at the, Norwich University, working in the Department of Biology. And I'd like to talk to you today about my research on personality, its intersection with the social environment, and the subjects of my research are wild fish populations, stickleback species. Okay, so I'd like to start out by giving you two sort of opposing views of individuality that I grew up with. On one hand, you see Marty Stauffer, uh, who did a series of wildlife documentaries that I saw when I was a kid in the 80s. And, in this show, you saw him sort of pigeonholing species into one set of behaviors. Busy as a beaver, sly as a fox. Salmon always go back to the place where they were born to lay their eggs, and on and on and on. Sort of summarizing a whole species by one set of behaviors. The other perspective is represented pretty well by Mr. Rogers, who is always saying that everyone is unique and everyone is special, and all of this variation in behavior that we see in people is really important. Okay, so fast forward to my professional career in science. Um, I'm trying to I was trying to sort of reconcile these two sort of loves of my childhood, studying of animal behavior, and also the appreciation of variation. And so along came evolutionary theory, and it sort of gave me the opportunity to reconcile those two things. And so the first thing I want to show is sort of this idea of natural selection selecting for sort of one optimal trait. There's there's some sort of central intermediate value of traits that are the optimum, and sort of everything around that optimum is just random noise that'll be selected away by natural selection. In other words, you're not special. You're just sort of an accident of nature if you are too far on one side of the optimum, or too far on the other side. There is, of course, the alternative view of evolution, where things like disruptive selection and an adaptive landscape that has multiple adaptive peaks um, talk about how variation is, it's not just noise around some optimal trait, but it's actually really important. It's actually sort of the focus of natural selection. And so I actually spent a short time in Edmund Brody III's lab, and he has this famous paper where he showed that to understand fitness in these snakes, it was really important to understand uh, not just coloration and not just behavior, but rather the combination of coloration and behavior to really understand fitness. Okay, so with all that in mind, I'll introduce you to my first study subject. This is the three spine stickleback, which probably needs no introduction in this crowd. But anyway, if you're not familiar with this fish, it's a small fish species that lives. It's marine, it's freshwater, it's everything in between, and it lives all around the northern hemisphere. The important thing is that you understand that it's actually very small. In fact, the picture that you're seeing on your screen right now is probably bigger than life size. So these guys have a lot to be afraid of. They're prey for a lot of different species. Okay, so in my first field season, I was out doing observations, a lot of snorkeling, watching these fish in the wild, and I noticed something that was very exciting to me. I noticed that I would often see sort of large groups of these fish, and that was exciting to me because I was interested in social behavior. So you can see they're sort of cohesively swimming about together. And then I would also see every once in a while an individual that was seemed to be not really interested in hanging out in groups. Even when a large group would swim past, these individuals would stay sort of on their own. Okay, and so You know, in reading the literature at the time about animal personality, boldness is one of those traits that was, getting a lot of attention. And I started wondering if maybe there was some connection between hanging out in a group and boldness. And sort of the two schools of thought that I saw out there at the time was, on one hand, that being in a group, of course, means safety in numbers. And so if you tend to hang out in a group, that must mean that you are risk averse sort of across the board. So, in the presence of a predator, you'd be less active. If you had the option of hanging out in a refuge or swimming out into a novel environment, you would stay in the refuge longer. And all of that would go along with being more likely to join a group. The other school of thought is sort of looking at those two traits, the trait of being in a social group and being bold, as potentially independent and complementary to each other as far as fitness goes. So it might be, this is how the thinking goes, at least in my mind, it might be okay to be particularly reckless as long as you hang out in a group. However, if you're already sort of risk averse in just about everything you do, it might not actually be that important to join a group, and it might actually be bad for you because you have to deal with competition. Okay, so in an early field season, all I did was just sort of look to see which correlation I would find out there, what relationship there is between being in a social group and boldness. So I collected fish that were alone in the field, and I collected fish that were in groups in the field, in these groups that you saw in the video. And then I put them through this open field test. That's a pretty standard test where you just put fish in a refuge and then look at how long it takes them to come out of the refuge. And so I found that the fish that were alone in the river were more cautious in this open field test. And the fish that were in groups, the shoalers, were bolder. They came out of the refuge much more rapidly. Okay, so then, of course, you're thinking, okay, wait a minute. How permanent is social environment? Sure, you snorkeled with them for a while and saw that they were in groups for a while or by themselves for a while, but how permanent is this? And so I've got another paper where we developed a whole technique for quantifying consistent individual differences in schooling behavior. And long story short, we found that tendency to school has fairly high repeatability as far as repeatability goes, and with about 57% of the variation being explained by differences between individuals. Okay, so I've got this relationship that I'm fairly confident in between boldness and social environment. And so then I started thinking about possible mechanisms that might explain it. And I'll lay out the mechanisms as I was thinking about them sort of early on. And so the first one I want to talk about is the possibility that we've got two environments, right? In my case, two social environments. And we have variation in behavioral type on the y-axis. It's possible that you would end up seeing a correlation between social environment, being a loner, and being risk averse, being very cautious. If very cautious individuals basically were avoiding groups, if they were trying to sort of go it alone and go to places that were less populated, perhaps, right? So sort of dispersing away from groups, while excuse me, while bolder behavioral types, if they found themselves alone, they'd get a little uncomfortable and disperse away from those areas, and therefore end up in sort of more populated areas. On the other hand, sort of a very related mechanism, and perhaps more likely, you would see some behavioral types, for example, the very bold individuals, actually drawn to social groups. So they seem to have a preference for joining social groups. And on the other hand, cautious individuals have a preference for places that are not very populated. So those are very closely related. Another mechanism is that plasticity might be involved, where sort of at the beginning of life, individuals sort of start out with a preference for social environment. Some individuals like being alone, and then the experiences of being alone tend to make them more cautious, while some individuals prefer to be with other fish. And then sort of the experience of being with other fish means that they become more bold. And then finally, natural selection might have an important role. It's possible that we start out with a random assortment of behavioral types in both the loner environment and the social, hanging out in a social group environment. And then over time, natural selection whittles away at different ends of the spectrum of behavioral type variation. And so actually, I want to focus on this last one and talk about it in the next study I'm going to show you. So I went out and I did a study. We did a mark recapture study to test the hypothesis that social environment impacts the fitness associated with being bold or cautious. So we went out and we collected fish that were alone or fish that were hanging out in groups. We brought them into our sort of field lab and did a different test of boldness. This time we used a predatory fish model. And so I'll just show you very briefly what that test looks like. Sorry, it's kind of hard to see the fish here, so I put a red box around it. In the red box, you see the stickleback, and then when the sculpin model pops in, you can see it takes off and hides. And we just looked at how long it would take for that fish to start moving again after that simulated attack as a measure of boldness. So then we marked the fish and put them back in the river. We gave them all a unique individual ID and put them back in the river, and then waited 2 weeks to do our recapture. And I could spend a long time talking about why we had really favorable conditions for this study and why I think 2 weeks was long enough. First of all, what I would like to say is that the river was almost dried up. This was during a drought, and so dispersal wasn't possible because upstream and downstream of this section of the river was completely dry. So I don't think dispersal was an issue here, even though we were in a river. And then the other thing is 2 weeks isn't very long to wait to go back and do a recapture, but the video that I'm showing on repeat here is of a natural predator that was there every day. It was a whole group of mergansers that were just devouring these fish. We would go out there after the mergansers would leave, and we would see dead, like half-eaten stickleback everywhere. So they were being annihilated by these guys and all kinds of other predators that were coming and feasting in this pool. Okay, so we came back 2 weeks later and collected as many fish as we could. Again, I think we did a good job. I could talk about that for a long time, but I'll just give you the punchline here. So the first half of the data, this is just the data for the fish that were alone when we originally caught them. Among the fish that were alone when we originally caught them, the more cautious fish were more likely to survive the 2 weeks. And then the second half of the data, these are the fish that were hanging out in a group when we caught them originally. Among the fish that were hanging out in a group originally when we caught them, the less cautious fish were more likely to survive. So sort of the opposite of the above result. Okay, and so this, the result of this study actually kind of makes sense to me. So it's okay to be a very sort of reckless individual as long as you're going to hang out in a group and you get that sort of added benefit of safety in numbers. On the other hand, if you're going to be cautious anyway, if you're not going to, go through life and be reckless, perhaps you should forego all of the problems of being in a social group. For example, competition for food. Okay, and so then I just have one last thing, and this is sort of a where I want to leave my talk. This is a study done by Willa Lane, an undergraduate at Norwich University at the time. She went out and collected fish from a wetland and an adjacent stretch of the Dog River that runs through Northfield, Vermont. And this is, I might call these two populations because they're usually separated. There's usually not water flowing from the wetland above ground directly into the river. It sort of goes underground before it seeps into the river. So for the most part, these are two separate populations, but there is frequent flooding that connects the wetland to the river. So I don't know if I should call it two separate populations. But anyway, what Willa found was she took fish from these two populations and put them in an artificial pool and observed schooling, and found that the fish from the wetland schooled less than the fish from the river. And so, her potential explanation was, maybe the fish from the wetlands school less because there's more vegetation there, so they rely more on that strategy for avoiding being spotted by predators, being camouflaged, while the fish in the river relied more on safety in numbers. And so this is just a preliminary result. I need to grab data from many more populations before I'm confident in this. But I just kind of wanted to end my talk there with something new that I'm trying to fit into my sort of big picture here, and I'm not sure how. So thanks for watching my talk. If you want to get in touch with me, my email is on the screen now. I'm at the Department of Biology at Norwich University.